A group of Russian noblemen are standing in a palace basement, staring at a dead body on the floor. The man they have just poisoned, shot, and beaten is lying completely still on a bearskin rug. The doctor in the room checks for a pulse. Nothing. He is dead. They go upstairs to celebrate. Then one of them, Prince Felix Yusupov, decides to go back down to check one more time. He leans over the body, the eyes open. The green eyes of a viper. Then the dead man grabs him by the throat. What followed next is one of the most extraordinary and disputed stories in all of history. A man who absorbed enough poison to kill 5 men, who was shot multiple times and kept moving, who was beaten, bound, and thrown into a frozen river. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about the death of Rasputin. The most famous version of this story, the poison, the resurrection, the river, may never have happened at all. And the real truth of what happened in that palace basement is in some ways even darker. To understand why some of the most powerful men in Russia gathered in a palace basement to kill one man, you have to understand who Rasputin was and how a peasant from Siberia ended up controlling the most powerful royal family in the world. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in the tiny village of Pokrovskoye in western Siberia, a remote frozen settlement so obscure that most Russians had never heard of it. His father was a horse trader. His family was dirt poor. He received almost no formal education. By every measure of the time, he was nobody. Then as a teenager, something happened to him that he could never fully explain. He underwent a profound religious experience that transformed him completely. He abandoned his ordinary life and became a wandering holy man, traveling across Russia on foot, visiting monasteries. He fasting for days, developing what he believed were genuine powers of prayer and healing. He was not a monk. The title Mad Monk that history gave him was always inaccurate. He was a mystic, a self-proclaimed healer, and a man of extraordinary personal magnetism. People who met him described being unable to look away from his eyes, pale, penetrating, hypnotic. He had a presence that defied explanation. Word of this strange wandering holy man spread through Russian society. And in 1906, it reached the ears of the people who needed him most. Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra were the rulers of the Russian Empire, one of the most powerful monarchies on earth. But privately, they were desperate parents living in terror. Their only son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, suffered from severe hemophilia. In that era, before modern medicine, a hemophilia was essentially a death sentence. Any cut, any bruise, any internal bleed could kill him. The boy had already nearly died multiple times. The Tsar and Tsarina had tried everything, every doctor in Russia, every specialist in Europe. Nothing worked. When Rasputin was brought to the palace in 1906 and introduced to the sick child, something extraordinary happened. The bleeding stopped. Alexei's condition improved in ways the doctors could not explain. Whether it was hypnosis, whether it was prayer, whether it was simply the calm that Rasputin projected that reduced the boy's anxiety and slowed his heart rate, nobody knows. What they knew was that it worked, and from that moment, Rasputin was untouchable. Alexandra became completely devoted to him. She called him our friend. She wrote him letters. She asked his advice on political matters, on military appointments, on affairs of state. As World War I tore Russia apart and the Tsar left the capital to command his armies, Alexandra leaned on Rasputin more and more. For the Russian nobility and the church, this was a catastrophe. They watched a filthy, barely literate Siberian peasant with a reputation for drunkenness and sexual excess essentially governing Russia through a besotted Tsarina. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's whims. Military decisions were influenced by his prophecies. The empire was crumbling, and a madman was whispering in the ear of the woman running it. Something had to be done. By late 1916, Russia was in crisis. The war was catastrophic. Millions of soldiers dead, the economy destroyed, the people starving and furious. Revolution was in the air. And yet the Tsarina continued to shield Rasputin from all criticism, convinced that without him, her son would die. Among the Russian nobility, a desperate conviction had taken hold. Rasputin had to be eliminated, not for personal reasons. They genuinely believed that removing him was the only way to save the Romanov dynasty. The man who stepped forward to lead the plot was Prince Felix Yusupov. He was 29 years old, impossibly wealthy. The Yusupov family was said to be second only to the Romanovs themselves in terms of riches, and deeply connected to the royal family. He had married Princess Irina, the Tsar's only niece. He was educated at Oxford. He was charming, cultured, and utterly ruthless when he decided something needed to be done. Around him, he gathered 4 co-conspirators. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's own first cousin. Vladimir Purishkevich, a fiery right-wing politician. Captain Sukhotin, a military officer, and Dr. Lazovert, a military doctor whose particular role was preparing the poison. They chose the basement of Yusupov's magnificent Moika Palace in St. Petersburg as their location. The basement had been decorated to look like a comfortable sitting room, rugs, furniture, a fireplace, a table laid with food and wine. The trap was set. To lure Rasputin in, Yusupov used a simple and devastating piece of bait. He told Rasputin that his beautiful wife, Princess Irina, would be at the palace that night and wanted to meet him. Rasputin had reportedly admired Irina for years. In fact, Princess Irina was not at the palace at all. She was away in Crimea. Rasputin agreed to come. On the night of December 29th, 1916, in the early hours of what would become December 30th, Rasputin dressed in his finest clothes, his best embroidered peasant shirt, and was quietly collected from his apartment. He was driven through the dark and frozen streets of St. Petersburg to the Moika Palace. He went down into the basement willingly. He never came back up alive. What happened next in that basement is the most contested sequence of events in all of Russian history. The account that the world knows, the account told for over a century in books, films, and documentaries, comes almost entirely from Prince Yusupov's memoirs, published in 1928, 12 years after the murder. And as we will see, there are very serious reasons to doubt almost everything in it. But first, the legend, because the legend is extraordinary. According to Yusupov, Rasputin was brought down to the basement where a table had been laid with cakes and wine. Dr. Lazovert had laced everything with cyanide, enough poison to kill 5 men. The cakes, 3 types of wine, all of it poisoned. Rasputin sat down and began to eat and drink. He ate the cakes. He drank the wine. He drank more wine. And nothing happened. The conspirators upstairs listened through the ceiling in mounting terror. An hour passed. 2 hours. They could hear Rasputin below, apparently in good spirits, drinking more wine, asking for more cakes. The poison was having absolutely no effect. We were seized with an insane dread that this man was inviolable, wrote the doctor later, that he was superhuman, that he couldn't be killed. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, Yusupov could wait no longer. He went back down to the basement alone, picked up a revolver, told Rasputin to look at the crucifix on the wall, and shot him in the chest. Rasputin collapsed onto the bearskin rug. The other conspirators rushed down. The doctor examined him. He was dead. They went back upstairs. 20 minutes later, Yusupov returned to the body. He reached down and shook Rasputin's shoulder. The eyes opened. Rasputin lurched upright, grabbed Yusupov by the throat, tore an epaulette from his shoulder, and began to strangle him. Yusupov tore himself free and ran up the stairs screaming. Behind him, Rasputin staggered to his feet, crawled toward the door that led to the courtyard, wrenched it open, and passed out into the darkness. The conspirators ran after him. Purishkevich fired 4 shots into the fleeing figure in the courtyard. 2 missed, 2 hit. Rasputin fell. They beat him with a rubber truncheon. They tied his hands. They wrapped him in a blue curtain. And they drove to the Little Nevka River, cut a hole in the ice, and threw him in. 3 days later, the body was pulled from the river, and the autopsy reportedly found water in his lungs, meaning Rasputin had been alive when they threw him into the frozen river. He had survived the poison, survived being shot multiple times, survived the beating, and ultimately drowned under the ice of a frozen river in the Russian winter. The legend of the man who could not be killed was complete. Except almost none of it may be true. Here is where your story gets something that almost no other Rasputin video will ever give you: the actual forensic truth. Because modern forensic scientists and historians have gone back to the original evidence. The autopsy reports, the physical evidence from the scene, the testimony of Rasputin's own daughter, the timeline. And what they found dismantles almost everything Yusupov wrote. A forensic review published in a medical journal found that a photograph of Rasputin's body shows a contact gunshot wound to his forehead, meaning a gun pressed directly against his head and fired at point-blank range. This would indicate that Rasputin was already dead before being dropped into the river. There was no drowning, no water in the lungs in the actual autopsy report. The autopsy reports do not mention poison. And Rasputin's own daughter Maria wrote in 1929 that her father hated sweet foods and never would have eaten a plate of cakes. The entire cyanide cake story, the centerpiece of the legend, was almost certainly fabricated. So why did Yusupov invent it all? Historians now believe that Yusupov deliberately embellished his account to transform what was actually a simple execution into an epic struggle of good versus evil, largely to sell more copies of his memoir. After fleeing Russia following the revolution, Yusupov was broke. His palaces, his estates, his fortune, all gone. The story of Rasputin was his only asset. He made it as dramatic as possible because dramatic stories sell. The reality appears to be this: Rasputin arrived at the palace, was almost certainly shot almost immediately, and was already dead when they threw him into the river. The hours of poisoning, the resurrection, the courtyard chase very likely never happened. But here is what that truth makes even darker. 5 of the most powerful men in Russia, a prince, a grand duke, a politician, a military officer, a doctor, lured a man to his death with a lie about a woman, executed him in a basement, and then spent the rest of their lives building a mythology around it to make themselves look like heroes battling a supernatural monster, rather than what they actually were, men who murdered someone. Not one of them was ever arrested. Not one was ever charged. The Tsar exiled Yusupov and Dmitry Pavlovich, arguably protecting them from the revolution that was coming. Both survived. Rasputin's killers lived long, comfortable lives in Europe, while the dynasty they claimed to be saving collapsed within months of his death. Rasputin's murder did not save the Romanovs. It did not stop the revolution. It did not change anything. Within 3 months of his death, Nicholas II had abdicated. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was finished. And by July 1918, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and all 5 of their children, including young Alexei, whose life Rasputin had reportedly saved again and again, were executed by Bolshevik firing squad in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The very dynasty Yusupov claimed to be protecting was gone within 18 months of Rasputin's death. Alexandra had warned them. She had written to Nicholas after Rasputin's murder, "If he is killed by common men, you will not survive 6 months." She was wrong about 6 months. She was right about everything else. Rasputin himself had written a letter shortly before his death, as if he knew what was coming. In it, he wrote that if he was killed by peasants, the Tsar would rule for hundreds of years. But if he was killed by nobles, by the boyars, the Tsar and his family would not survive 2 years and would be killed by the Russian people. He was killed by nobles. The Tsar and his family were dead within 2 years. Whether that makes Rasputin a genuine prophet, or simply a man with a clear understanding of the revolutionary forces building around him, that is a question that has never been answered. What is answered is this: a peasant born in absolute obscurity in a forgotten Siberian village rose to become the most powerful unofficial figure in the largest empire on earth. He was feared by princes and politicians. He was loved absolutely by an empress. He became so threatening to the established order that the richest man in Russia personally came to kill him. And even his death, simple execution in a palace basement, became so mythologized that over 100 years later, the world still tells the story of a man who could not die. Grigori Rasputin. He never held a title. He never commanded an army. He never passed a law. He just refused to be ordinary. And that, in the end, was enough to change the world. The Moika Palace still stands in St. Petersburg today. The basement where Rasputin spent his last hours has been preserved. Visitors can still walk down those stairs and stand in the room where it happened. On the wall, there is a small display, photographs, documents, the bearskin rug, and in a glass case the clothes Rasputin wore that night, his finest embroidered peasant shirt, still there, over 100 years later. The man who wore it came from nothing, owned nothing, left nothing behind except a story so powerful that no one can agree on what actually happened, and no one can stop telling it. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Subscribe to Fading Chronicles for more true stories told completely, from the very beginning to the very end.